All right, so welcome, Yannick Jacob, to your own podcast.
Well,
Absolutely delighted to have you here. Um,
yeah, it's nice to be here. It's nice that when you said, well, let's turn the tables, right?
yeah, yeah.
I would really like to interview you and kind of reflect a little bit. I'm excited about this concept, and I always like talking to you. I think there's always really fruitful dialogue, and I know you really believe in dialogue. So I'm excited about this. I'm consciously and purposefully not prepared at all, and see where our curiosity gets us.
Good, good. Well, for those listening, the reason why we've decided to do this is because, in a sense, you are this kind of mysterious figure who interviews all these guests about coaching, but we don't necessarily know where you're coming from, what your beliefs are, what your skills are, what your background is, what you're fascinated by. I often hear, knowing you as I do, I often hear glimmers of your thought process behind the questions. And sometimes I hear you wanting to challenge, but knowing that there are guests, so you can't really quite challenge as robustly as you want to. And then sometimes I can hear you in full agreement, but not wanting to, let's say, collude as an interviewer. So I'm really interested to put you in the spotlight for the first time and to get a sense of who you are, so that when you do more interviews, we have a better sense of your journey. I've known you now for, I think, since 2015, I think.
Yeah, that's right.
8 years. I knew you first as an existential coach, relatively, if I can say this, relatively wet behind the ears, but,
Fair.
but very enthusiastic, and somebody I immediately saw was going places, which always impresses me because it's to do with the energy they exude and not necessarily what they've already done. And so I saw in you a kindred spirit of somebody who was fascinated by both coaching and not just coaching, but what sits behind coaching, the human layer, if you like, that makes coaching even possible. So that's how I got to know you. You then trained with me as a supervisor, and then ended up training for my supervision school, ICCS. But that's just our little bit. You, though, have your own very successful coaching practice as an existential coach, positive psychology coach, a supervisor with Rocket Supervision. You have Coaching Lab, which seems to be, from the outside, seems to be flourishing and seems to be your big baby at the moment, as well as your actual baby.
Yeah, that one keeps me busier than the others.
Exactly. I've also been always struck by your, is prolificity a word? Your prolificness, anyway. I like prolificity. Yeah, I've been struck by how prolific you are in all the articles you write. And you've written the first book on, well, not the first, but one of the major books on existential coaching, published by Routledge. And I just feel like you're everywhere in a good sense. Like you're somebody that's just so hungry to make a difference to coaching. So that's my take on you, Yannick. I'm kind of curious if there's anything you want to add to that would give us a bit more of a rounded picture.
Oh, yeah. First of all, thank you. It's always nice to hear these things reflected back, right? Because that really resonates. I am a hungry, right, to help coaches be better coaches. I really do believe in what coaching offers. And even the word coaching is such a broad range of what it can be. I'm really amazed by the power of a space that's held in the way that most coaches do hold space, and what that does for people. And there's so much versatility in that. Integration has been a big theme of my life. And in the beginning, it was difficult for me to kind of sit with that because I had all these different interests and sometimes really opposing interests almost, or seemingly mutually exclusive interests. Even within academia, positive psychology and existentialism seem to be so far apart, but actually I have that kind of lens bringing things together. And coaching is such an integrative practice where you naturally borrow from different approaches and different schools and different paradigms, different ideologies. So bringing things together, bringing people together, bringing ideas together, bringing concepts and approaches to coaching together. I've been always fascinated by that. And that's definitely been a theme throughout my personal life and also throughout my professional life. So naturally, coaching is a wonderful playground for me because it's not so limited by rules and regulations. And it's also drawing from so many different spaces and so many different ideas of how we can have dialogue and how we can hold space and how we can help people advance. So the work with coaches is something that I currently focus on. There's other branches, but currently, as you rightly seen, I'm really focusing on creating spaces where coaches can integrate and where coaches can find themselves, and who am I as a coach, and how can I be a better coach, and how can I create these spaces for other people in a way that the world benefits, because I really see the impact of coaching as very generative. It used to be very much about me and what can I do that's really aligned with my strength and what I find meaningful and what I'm good at. But then it started around the age of 30. My impact in terms of meaning really shifted much more to the outside, giving something back to other people, to the coaching community, and to the world as a whole. So when I talk about generative effect, you work with one coach, that coach is going to work with potentially hundreds of thousands of people in their lives and affecting them very powerfully. That has an impact on the communities of the people that are being affected, the workplaces, the countries, the world as a whole. Peter Hawkins talks about affecting shifts in consciousness, and that can be done on an individual level, but his lens is systemic, and more I've moved into this, you can have a huge impact, one person at a time or many people at a time, on what kind of change we're creating in the world in terms of how people listen to each other, how they're being with each other, how they're holding space for each other, how they're communicating, how they're relating to themselves and the world. So I'll pause there. I think who are you, and rounding yourself off is not a one-sentence thing, but that theme of integration and creating space and the generative effect of coaching, that's definitely big points in my life's mission, I guess.
And I always felt that from you in a way that wasn't just about coaching, because I remember you would always skateboard to our office and you'd be off in Germany doing some huge music festival as a DJ. And there was something that struck me about you, which was about, you didn't just do coaching, you lived coaching. And what I mean by that is you lived the joy of life. So I don't just mean coaching as a unknowing space, but coaching as a belief in human potential.
Yeah,
across to me.
Yeah, that's a theme that keeps popping up recently more and more as I'm working with coaches and training coaches, supervisors as well. There's this shift that happens at some point for people, or for many coaches, where you stop doing coaching or supervision. You start being a coach and supervisor. You embody quite naturally, you have ingrained or internalized the theoretical model or theoretical lenses or philosophical foundation. And it's so internalized that it becomes you. So then, sometimes coaches ask, there's a friend and we started having a coaching conversation. I'm not sure if that's okay, because now am I coaching a friend? Well, there isn't a formal framework for the coaching right now, but if you're being a coach, then of course you would hold space and be curious and, not judge. So it can be difficult to draw the line. And I think a lot of my work of becoming the coach I am has been grounded in what is my experience of being human, because, being a coach also means being a person. And when that integrates, when you're just showing up very authentically as you, yes, within a professional framework, but you cannot separate the private person from the professional person, I think. And a lot of these insights, they do happen when you're out in the world and being faced with who you are by how you are in relation with others in various different contexts.
You mentioned the word integration quite a few times, Yannick, and I'm curious about that. When I first started coaching, it was considered quite a simple process in a way. You had the grow model and you had SMART goals and so on. And then very quickly that shifted and coaching began to get more and more and more depth. And I'm kind of curious, how, as somebody who's seen coaching over the last 15 years or so, how have you made sense of coaches' journey towards integration and pluralism? And what challenges does that throw up, as well as what opportunities? I'm kind of curious on your overall take on that.
Yeah, that reminds me, we still need to get Mick Cooper on the podcast, talk about pluralistic coaching. And he's also a great guy. How do I make sense of that? Well, I think it's helpful at the beginning when you introduce someone to anything. Let's take coaching in this example, is to introduce something that can be simple, right? And coaching can be simple. We can offer the GROW model or a similar model, toolkit, practice. Like there's so many structured processes we can take somebody through to achieve some sort of outcome, right? And I think it's helpful to look at that not in isolation, but in its simplicity. Right? Here's a process, and if you follow these 4 steps, and maybe there's a bit of circular movement, you might need to switch to a couple of steps. But here's a way that you can grasp what this is, or at least what it can be. So if you don't take that as dogma and you allow to challenge that as you move beyond the simplicity of it, we can add manageable chunks into that and expand what we can do for people. Regardless of how you were trained in coaching, chances are you start with something that is simple and then you add in bits of complexity. I've noticed that when I train existential coaches and somebody comes in who's not a coach yet, who's just at the beginning, it's a lot there, right? Because it's very open. The existential lens is not known for this is how you do it and this is how it's done, right? Appreciating authenticity and doing it in a way that is you. Existential coaching can be done in so many different ways, really depends on who the coach is. So starting with existential coaching is difficult because it's complex, right? So I think it's helpful that we start with a simple model and then we add in the complexity as the coaching demands grow. When you start out coaching, it's helpful to look for a client who's bringing something that is relatively tangible, right? Oh, I want to get a promotion. And, it's not that I'm struggling with this anxiety and these huge questions. And I mean, that's what coaches are naturally drawn to. This is the exciting, meaningful conversations. But in order to become good at the skills of coaching, maybe in the beginning, pick some people who have something relatively straightforward. Maybe not the overthinkers who think very complex or the people with a huge stuff and lots of baggage from their childhood. Maybe look at, I want to move country and I have some things to figure out, or I want to become a better listener at work. That's how you can train some of these skills in the begining a lot better, I think.
Where do you think the edge is at the moment? Where is the point where you get to and the boundary's like, whoa, that doesn't feel like coaching at all anymore? Or is there one?
Yeah, so working with or around trauma has been a huge subject. I think that generally points to coaching expanding so much into what was traditionally seen as a therapeutic space. And that includes, working with psychedelics, for example. I have like a dozen podcast episodes on exploring the intersection there. There's a lot that goes into depth. Working with trauma, we're not trying to heal trauma, but coaching has expanded into the mental health spectrum, and coaches have understood that coaching has something to offer to people, even to people who are suffering or might be diagnosed with some clinical condition or something, their neurodiversity, right? ADHD, autism support coaching. There's something that coaching can help with, especially if you have a lens. Existentialism is one of those lenses that isn't pathologizing people, that just says, well, there's very different people out there. We don't really see them as broken or that there's something wrong with them or something lacking, but they're just, people are very different from each other. And what's normal anyway? So if we meet people from that position, then yes, you can offer a coaching model. But also, at what point is somebody really considered quite vulnerable and you really want to know what you're doing and how to hold space? And you can actually break a lot more when you're going in with someone at depth that's really suffering right now. Working with addiction, for example, is I'd stay far away from that as a coach, but I know there's fantastic coaches who really offer fantastic support to people who struggle with addiction. That's very related to trauma, right? So trauma conscious, trauma informed coaching. I think every coach will benefit from understanding trauma better. But I don't think coaching is the right way to heal the trauma. But then also I know some coaches who call themselves coaches because nobody can tell them they can't. And they have some trauma healing techniques and it seems to work really well for them. But I think this is where an expansive edge is, that coaches have much bigger conversations now, and they hold space that has traditionally been like, no, don't go there. That's not coaching. Definitely not. Now the gray space between coaching and therapy is enormous. And it's what I often say is it's really about what are you willing and able to work with. And I think both are really important. Just because you are a trained therapist who is also a coach now doesn't mean that you have to do that kind of work. But you need to be able to do that kind of work. And those two questions, they're difficult, right? What makes me able to work with someone who struggles with, really difficult childhood experiences, or, a recent bereavement, for example?
You've obviously now interviewed a lot of coaches as a result of, well, your own work, but also our podcast. And I'm curious, what's your sense of what makes coaching then? There's got to be a point where coaching means something that means when you cross that line, it's not just about its therapy, it's just no longer coaching. So what for you is coaching?
Yeah. So there's two questions, right? What is coaching? And I think that everybody has to answer that question themselves. And that goes back to, am I willing and able to hold this space? What do I call it? Is it still called coaching? The question seems less and less important to me, whether we call it coaching. At some point I thought, well, should I just call it sitting down with Yannick? And then I get rid of that conversation. It doesn't sell so well, right? Because people don't really look for coaching yet, or at least not as many as I would like to. But it is a thing that people have some sort of concept for. But then usually the concept that they have is not what you consider coaching. So what is coaching? Well, there's so many different definitions. For me, I know that there's a boundary at which it is no longer helpful to work with me. It's going to be more helpful to work with somebody else. And that's a lived experience that I have. I usually have a feeling in my kind of stomach area, bottom left, kind of there's this sensation that I get when it tells me, Yannick, I don't think you're the right person here. I don't think what you do, whatever anybody would call it, is the right thing to offer. My sense of coaching, for me, coaching is going forward, and that is still in existential coaching, particularly. You pay a lot of attention to what's in front of you. It's not necessarily solution focused. If somebody comes to me and they don't know where they're going, that they can figure that out. I'm happy to hold that space. But there's something around coaching that is agile, that is, I have a desire, a drive to kind of figure something out, or to move, or to create something, and if that creation is an insight or a clarity or a feeling, it's the same thing. So yeah, that for me, it's a lived experience, and I could intellectualize it, right? I could say, well, coaches generally work with people who are relatively resourceful, and they're not in a deep hole, and they just need holding to let themselves come out of it. You could say that, coaching is more future oriented. It's about the present and the future rather than the past and the present. But I talk about the past quite a lot. I think it makes us who we are. It's quite important. And you could also say, well, coaching does a lot of the behavioral stuff. It's a lot more about surface than about depth. But also that in its own, it doesn't really work, especially not in existential coaching. If you take all of these together, you have a starting point for making sense of what coaching is and isn't. But ultimately, really, every coach needs to decide for themselves what their framework is.
I'm going to push you just a little bit on this, because I a curiosity of my own. But for the word coach to exist, even though it will change and evolve and so on, for the word coach to exist in a way we can all roughly make sense of, or decide we belong to or don't belong to, there's got to be some grain of commonality. And I'm kind of, is that an epistemological commonality? Like we all believe that we don't have the answer, or is it but then again, sort of humanistic psychotherapists? Like, is it just a configuration of some of these philosophical principles that we might draw from different parts of the world, like this from humanistic and this from CBT? And maybe you don't have the answer, but I'm kind of curious if we can find a little crystallization.
I would like that to be that. And they are readily available, right? I mean, we have 3 major professional bodies. There are other professional bodies, but these, AC, EMCC, ICF, they define coaching relatively well. Right? They've worked on this definition quite well. They thought carefully about what the aspects, what the elements are. I really liked a couple of your definitions and frameworks, and there's one from I think 2013. You wrote it in a book that I still show to students. This is a really good framework for coaching. But I wish there was one, but I don't think there's ever going to be one. So I think they help us.
Can I interrupt, Yannick?
Yeah.
Can I interrupt?
Yeah.
Because
Sure.
I accept that there isn't one, but I'm curious what yours is. So for me, I would say coaching is an epistemological position.
Uh-huh.
That's fundamentally what it is. That is oriented towards change.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm kind of curious if you have one. You feel like that's my concept of coaching, regardless of what the AC does or the EMCC and so on.
Yeah. Coaching for me is a space that you create where you work in partnership. And what you're doing is you pay attention to what's happening in front of you. I want to invite and be really curious to figure out what do you want to do, what do you want to know, what do you want to create, and then to really pay attention to hold that space, to be the fellow traveler. To maybe shine a light, help with your curiosity, help with listening. But it's mainly a space where people hear themselves talk and you partner with them to help them do whatever they want to do. So I have my positive psychology lens, my existential lens. They come in and make me really curious what's already going well, right? What resources can we build on? My existential lens helps me to be really curious about how do you relate to yourself? How do you relate to the world? What kind of inevitable human givens and dilemmas and paradoxes are you struggling with? And what's your experience of being human? What gives meaning to your life? How do you relate to endings and isolation and uncertainty, authenticity, freedom? That's kind of my position that I'm bringing into this, and encouraging people to make courageous choices ultimately, and opening up that there are choices. That's how I would put it in a framework. But every time I talk about what coaching is, it comes out a little bit different. But these are the elements that they always have in common.
Makes sense. Okay. As a coach now, how many years in? 15 years, maybe?
Yeah, 2010. Yeah, 13.
Mm-hmm. 13 years in. How would you say you've evolved? Where are you at now? Give us a sort of state of the nation report on Yannick Jacob as a coach.
A state of the nation report. In what way? How would I?
It's like we train as a coach, don't we? And then we go on a journey of evolution, and we're always evolving. But at any given point we can say, here's where I've got to at the moment. So what's grabbing your interest? How do you show up as a coach that perhaps you weren't showing up as a coach 5 years ago? Like, give us a bit of a sense of who you are today, rather than who you've been.
Yeah, so today I think the theme that is very present for me now is community, and I don't like the word scale, but I went through a process of building one-to-one, building the coaching work, really coming to terms with who am I, what am I offering, what is my style, how do I embody that space, how can I building confidence in holding that space for people so that I can show up authentically. I don't have to think about all these models and processes. It just comes naturally now, more or less. And then I branched out into supervision and into working with groups, and that was an amazing process. I loved the groups. And then bit by bit, I got a lot more passionate about bringing this more out there. And it started with training, and then it got a bit more visible and more public with the podcasts, various different podcasts, and having conversations, showing up in other people's communities, and really bridging the gaps between these often very insular coaching schools. I always didn't quite understand. I understood, but I didn't quite understand how, you graduate from a coaching school and then that's your tribe. And often they don't mix. And given my theme of integration, I always kind of walked the turf. I was I grew up with hip hop, right? So Afrika Bambaataa is the kind of role model to walk the turfs and have different people talk to each other and create spaces where people from very different approaches to coaching can come together and have dialogue and inspire each other and exchange experiences. So that really culminated now to building a space where we can build community, where people show up and exchange and have dialogue and challenge each other and support each other. So with the lab, with the cabinet, we run every third Tuesday of the month. There's just bringing people together, and now it's expanding and being more visible, getting more people into the sphere of knowing that this kind of spaces exist, right? So 2023 is really, for me, going to be about getting a lot of content out there, getting lots of conversations out there, lots of little snippets, lots of little training bits, lots of interesting models, ideas, exchanges, so that coaches well beyond the coaches that I have contact with right now, hopefully in lots more coaching schools or communities, letting them know that there's spaces where you can walk the turfs, right? And break out of your coaching paradigm and your coaching school and what you thought the limits and boundaries of the approach were, and get confronted with coaches who work very differently. I remember once I was at a training, and it was pretty much all co-active coaches and me. Just connected with someone, and they invited me in, and turns out that they were all from the same coaching approach, really. And it was the first time I saw a coach touch a client, because we're doing this exercise in a circle where somebody got into coaching, and then there was a timer, and after 3 minutes or so, the coach changed. And this one coach, they're just like, okay, let's stand up. And then they stood up, and they stood in this half embrace in the middle of the circle. And just, I'm like, what, you can do that? I mean, it was weird for me to see, but it was obviously very powerful for the client. And I'm like, wow, this really challenges me in terms of what can be done in a coaching space. I had never considered that, that could be done, and that was okay, because you don't really touch your clients unless they're like really in tears, and maybe like, no, but like that seemed pretty natural to this person. So I think it's important that we create those spaces where we explore boundaries and go beyond what we thought was possible. I mean, I think that's very in the spirit of coaching. So why not do it as coaches?
So at one level, I can hear that's going to be amazing for you to learn by watching other people and so on, which is great for your own development. And what's the ultimate purpose, though? Like, presumably there's an impact you want to make by bringing all these different coaches together and breaking down those boundaries and walking on different turfs. What's your aspiration in terms of the end outcome of that? Or at least not the end outcome, but one of the outcomes, let's say.
Yeah, well, an overarching kind of mission in life really is very inspired by the kind of existential perspective on, well, make courageous choices. Live life in a way that you're not gonna sit there and have regrets 20 years from now. Don't fight the inevitable and challenge dogma, right? Challenge the rules and follow them if you think they're good rules, but there's so many people out there, that includes coaches, who, like we said earlier, right, they appreciate having a simple framework. Just tell me how to do this and how to do this well, and then I'll go and do it, and then I'll be great. And that only works so far, so I think we have no choice but to go beyond that and to appreciate the complexity of what this practice is. And it feels safe when somebody told us, this is how you do coaching, and this is how you be a great coach, and these are the guidelines that you need to follow and the competencies that you need to have. And we're going to rate you and test you, and we're going to give you a stamp of approval, and now you're a masterful coach by the framework of whoever, and this is what it's like. But even an ICF master coach, they might see someone who's working trauma informed with a particular technique, and they're like, oh wow, I didn't know you could do that as a coach. This seems to be amazing. Interesting. And you can go rethink what those limitations or boundaries are, what those rules and frameworks are. And as soon as we do that, it's uncomfortable naturally, because you thought you knew, and then you're bringing uncertainty into certainty. But it's curious. So overall, it's that mission of encouraging people to challenge dogma, to be uncomfortable, and to value the discomfort of not knowing and going beyond what felt nice.
And I totally get that in terms of how you might grow yourself. And a lot of people might do that for themselves, but there's a passion you have for helping other people do that, isn't there? For helping other coaches break through those boundaries, because you could go on your own personal research mission and try out all these different modalities, and you're like, yeah, Yannick's the most integrated, holistic coaching model. You have a deeper passion to make other coaches do that too, and so not make, but to encourage and to provide the space for growth. Where's that coming from? What's the impact you want to make in the coaching world?
Yeah, where's that coming from? I don't know. The first thing my mind is going to is that I've grown up in a really fortunate way. I've been given so many opportunities and so much education. I mean, I've had my struggles in my life, and nobody's completely trauma free. But like, I've been lucky in the conditions I was born into, and I really feel that I want to give back. And I hinted on that earlier, but like, it doesn't. That kind of consciousness shift, right? That, I mean, we're in a crisis as humanity. It's a dangerous time. The decisions we make now as a species, they're gonna be really significant and potentially existence ending, right? The emergence of AI is going to be huge. I mean, ChatGPT, I've been playing around a little bit. I mean, this changes so much in the next 10 years. We're going to see changes we've never, ever seen before in our lifetimes, combined probably. So this is enormous. So if we are not staying agile and facing that kind of complexity in a way, as the existentialists would encourage us to do, then we're pretty doomed, right? So there is an existential threat, not an existential philosophical, but literally survival, that we need this kind of mindset, I believe, in order to survive this. But also I'm driven by exploration, right? I've always been curious, and I enjoy being in that space, and I enjoy holding a space where people have this aha moments and these glowing eyes, and they're like, oh, the beautiful moment when somebody considers something that they hadn't considered before, and then they go into their own space and they're like, whoa, this is individually wonderful to be in that kind of space, but also as a group, as humanity, important for us to survive. Not sure if that answered your question.
It did, didn't it, in its own kind of unique way, because that's the whole point, is it's going to be driven from somewhere deeper than just the process of showing coaches different modalities. It's coming from a place for you of quite a great depth. If it's okay, I wouldn't mind transitioning to a little bit of a conversation around the podcast, because it feels like that connects to this. Sure. You mentioned a love of exploration and learning. One of the things that strikes me is every time you do your podcast interviews, how much seemingly depth of research has gone into understanding that guest and really knowing their work. I'm kind of curious, number one, what attracted you to do the podcast, given that it was a fair amount of work? And number two, how did you go about getting under the skin of each coach that you come across?
Yeah, not to Russell Brand there, I guess. Under the skin is this podcast. So what attracted to me to it is that I always loved talking about coaching. I mean, that's how my own podcast started. People wanted to pick my brain on something coaching related. And as I had less and less kind of time in the diary, and as I've also noticed that during these conversations, I formulated things so clearly and so tangibly, maybe with the right kind of example, that I kept catching myself thinking, oh, I wish I would have recorded this. Just these last 5 minutes, they would have made for fantastic content. This has been so clear right now. I've never said it in this way before. I've never been able to explain it in this way before. Even when I sit down and I try to write it, there's things that happen in dialogue and in conversation that is just, it's so natural to tell stories, to be in conversation. I think it's how we best learn, naturally, right? Everybody has their own learning style, of course, but we've always learned through story and through conversations. I mean, that's, since the beginning of human beings, that's how we've learned. So podcasting became quite organically a means that I was very passionate about, because you could have reach a lot of people by letting them be part of a conversation with you. And I had an experience of, listening to a lot of Tim Ferriss's podcasts, for example, that I felt I was in the room with these people. I was part of the conversation, even though they didn't respond necessarily to what I was saying or thinking, but that to create those spaces, I always loved. So, obviously listened to a lot of Rob's podcasts and Coaching Uncaged when he was the host, and always loved the variety of the guests that came in. And in the context of what we just talked about, integration and bridging boundaries and walking the turfs, being able to invite people from very different modalities, Some I disagree with, some I agree with, but really exploring what they bring and let other people be part of that conversation is super, super meaningful. So when I'm not sure if you've reached out, if I asked you, I might have asked you, but when Rob left Animas, then I had always had my eye on that podcast, basically. So I just loved. I was on board immediately to host. It was a great honor to host that and have the production team in the background. I mean, I'll be forever grateful to have had all of these conversations so far already. It's just it expands my horizon. Hopefully, the guests get challenged as well, or rethink something, or having to explain something in a way that's clear. And that's been amazing, right? So, and in terms of research, I mean, some guests are easy because I know them. I might have a relationship with them, or I'm familiar with their work. I might have read their books. They're big people. They're thought leaders. So, Peter Hawkins, we have Jonathan Passmore is going to be on the podcast soon. And I can sit down and write a page, like a whole list of questions that I want to ask him that will make for, 2 weeks of podcast, just kind of from the hip. But with some I think you sent me a couple of guests and said, we should have this person on the podcast. I'm like, I never heard of this person. And then I look into their work, or I start reading their book, or I look into a couple of articles, or I watch a couple of other podcasts that they've done. And I love the process of exploring something. And I think if you're naturally curious, you have of course they're going to be, I always have a whole list of questions, about 70% of them I don't get to ask. But yeah, that's, I like the preparation part of it.
And given that curiosity has a purpose in a way, what and that purpose being learning, what have you learned, or how have you been affected in some way by all the guests you've spoken to?
Yeah, I did a whole talk on the first summit on transformative coaching. I think it's public, no? I think you've published that talk. You've kindly invited me to do the keynote, and I decided to review some of the lessons of what I took from, I think at that point it was a season and a half or something. Yeah. What struck me the most perhaps is how differently people view transformation. It's been obviously since Animas is a school for transformative coaching. I got curious. This is one of the questions that keeps returning. We've gone to lots of different places, but one question I try to always ask in some form or another is, what's your perspective, if any, on transformation and transformative coaching? And the bandwidth of, what that means to people, how they relate to the term, how various degrees of, theoretical or philosophical grounding they have in it, how much or how little they thought about what transformation actually means. I had one guest who I saw it on her website, and it offered transformational coaching, and I said, "Oh, you offer transformational coaching?" And she was like, "Oh yeah, I kind of need. That's what. Where did you find that? Yeah, that doesn't really make sense to me anymore."
I remember that. I've got to delete that, she said.
Yeah, so that was interesting, right? It's informative how people relate to it and view it, and that there isn't really that kind of depth. I was very impressed when we were on the podcast, right? I had you, and I kind of really explored your new thinking on transformative coaching. And I think there's not a lot of other people that have thought about transformative coaching or what transformation actually means in a way that is grounded in philosophy and psychology and some research, So as an academic, I wish there was a lot more of that. But as a practitioner, I know that it may or may not matter when you're in the room with someone, because there's a lot of people who do very intuitive work by just holding that kind of space for people. Yeah. I think we have more options when we have that kind of grounding. But I also know we don't need to know all of that in order to do fantastic coaching work. I think any coach will benefit from digging into some of the depth and really ground themselves. I think you show up differently when you have confidence in that approach and you feel literally grounded. You feel like there's a safety, there's a confidence, there is a calm that comes when a coach is grounded in and had really explored at depth what ground they're standing on. And, it feels secure when you meet someone like that because they're holding space from a different position. The image I have in my mind is that somebody told me a story of someone at a ceremony. It was a plant medicine ceremony where there was someone in the room who never spoke, but they were holding the middle of this teepee, and it felt to them that this is not just stopping in the ground. It felt like it was going through the ground. And this person, as little as they spoke, they were just there, and they were like just literally holding the space. And they didn't say anything, they didn't do anything, but just their presence, their grounded presence, made a huge difference to people who were in that space. And I think when we're connected, could be spiritually to the earth, but could also be theoretically and philosophically to our philosophical and theoretical frameworks, there is a presence that comes with it, which is very powerful.
Yeah, very interesting. Have you spoken to people on the podcast where in ways that have left you feeling, oh, that's an interesting avenue, I must explore that further?
I mean, there's a lot, right? We talked to Hetty Einzig about the transpersonal lens, and that obviously in the psychedelic work, that is a big thing, because Stanislav Grof is the godfather of kind of transpersonal psychology, and that digs into the Jungian framework as well. We're going to have a Jungian coach in the coaching lab next month. I would love to learn a lot more and dig a lot deeper into Jungian psychology and transpersonal coaching. I like that lens on it. I mean, I've dug in it a little bit, but there's just so much there that I have some issues with the collective unconscious, for example, and I would love to explore it more before I kind of dismiss it, because my lived experience is like, I haven't experienced that. I haven't felt that. So my phenomenological exploration of it is limited, but I'd like to expose myself to more people, because the people I talk to who are Jungians or into transpersonal psychology, I really like them, So maybe there's something there that I'm not seeing and I'm not understanding. Maybe there's something I'm not connecting to, or maybe it's just not something I agree with. But I'd love to go a little bit further in that direction.
Interesting, isn't it? Because you could potentially not buy into the ontological assumptions embedded in something like Jungian psychology, but still have a lot of connection to the axiological assumptions, as in the values that it represents. Because I'm a bit like you. I can't remember the author of the book, Swamplands of the Soul. It's a Jungian writer. Such a beautiful writer. But again, like you, I don't have a great deal of resonance with Jungian psychology per se, but I do with the way they speak about life, which is fascinating. It's like, hold on a sec, how can that make sense? As an existential coach, Yannick, to what extent do the boundaries of existential thinking prevent you from entering certain areas, or do they not get in the way? Because in a way, existentialism has its own kind of set of assumptions, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And I mean, they are quite broad. The school of existentialism I was brought up in here in the UK is largely influenced by Emmy van Derzen. I trained at her school, and it is relatively individual, right? The focus is more on the individual and their relationships with the existential givens across the four worlds of existence. And I remember sending the draft of my book for some I call it praise, right? But just for some feedback and maybe a little bit I could print in the book. And I sent it to Ernesto Spinelli, and he was very kind in how he formulated what he wrote to me, but he strongly encouraged me to look beyond that school of existentialism. And he's very relational, right? So that's quite systemic. And so there's a lot that opened up through that kind of feedback, that critical, challenging, quite uncomfortable at the time feedback. And I really value him for it, because it got me to put a lot of more different things in the book and really explore beyond that. And I guess it's in line with my own development. As I mentioned, I'm like more branching out and seeing myself as much more a part of the whole. So there are some assumptions and some misconceptions about existentialism that, for example, they're all atheists. That's not the case at all. There's plenty of Christian existentialists, for example. I mean, the godfather of existentialism, Søren Kierkegaard, was a devout Christian. He just had an issue with the church and the dogma of the church. So Martin Buber is another one, right? So there is for me personally, you know, what happens when we die, for example, or, you know, I still think you need to make the most out of right now. You know, I haven't connected to a deity or a religious framework other than perhaps Buddhism, but Buddhism doesn't have a deity really. So I think that is quite personal. And I think what we have is now, between now and when we're inevitably our body decays, might we prolong this, and for how long, right? The recent developments in biotech, nanotech, they started throwing into uncertainty what used to be a certainty, which is we're all going to die, right? Our body decays. Well, what if we could hack the biological system? How long does the brain last? And what kind of developments could be imaginable in the next 50 years? And I mean, if we know anything about development, especially exponential development, is that we can't possibly imagine what would happen in 50 years within exponential development, right? There was like 20 steps are 20 steps away, and 20 exponential steps are like, what was it, like 40 times around the world? Don't hit me on the numbers, but it's a huge difference. So when we think, well, maybe there isn't that kind of ending anymore, what happens then? And what happens to the human experience?
Huh? Maybe there never was, because the funny thing is, I remember my dad saying to me, Nicholas, there's two things we know. One, you're born, and two, you die. And I said, well, A, I don't remember being born, and B, I've not died yet. So even those two aren't certain for me. Let's be honest.
Yeah, I mean, what that leads to for me is the help we will need, the support that people will need in the next 50 years, let's say, to figure out what it means to be human when we live with all of this automation and all of these AIs that are going to do most of the jobs much better than any human could ever. I think we're going to be in a bit of a meaning crisis soon, where, you know, work is the main source of meaning for most people, meaning and purpose. So if we automate that and give it to an AI, like, well, who are we? What do we have to contribute? And so arts, culture, humanity, you know, I mean, AIs are going to be being able to be more empathetic with what people tell them in the digital coaching room than many humans will, you know, because they pick up on emotions in our physiological system and in our facial expressions better than many humans will be able to pick up emotions from your face. So that's going to be really important. So I think we need more existential coaches, or coaches who are existentially minded, or generally people who are well trained in holding that kind of space for someone to make sense of their human experience. So that goes beyond kind of questions of limitations of existentialism, because existentialism is just so broad. You know, there isn't a thought leader, there isn't a Freud, there isn't no, this is it, and you can only go this far, and here's a boundary. It always encouraged people to break the boundaries and question the certainties that you think you have. So I'm not sure if there is that kind of limitation. That's what makes it so exciting. You cannot really complete it.
Yeah, very interesting. There was I saw something recently. Somebody posted on LinkedIn about AI and coaching, and I was left with this feeling of, even if AI could ape, as you rightly said, potentially ape the empathic response, or notice things that allow for an empathic response, what they're not doing is suffering the same condition of being human. Mm-hmm. So even though they might be able to notice and respond to, they're not actually suffering the experience of being human, which I think is what you mean by the existential condition, let's say. So what you talked about, the existential coach being necessary, not just a coach per se. Is that so? Is there something about the fact that the coach is a human being going through the same stuff that feels important to the behavior that the coach does?
Yeah, that's super interesting, right? Because my stance for a long time was AI will never replace a coach, because there's a human-to-human relationship, and they're just not human. So you cannot create that experience of being in a relationship with another human being. But then I got a call from Google, and they were asking to confirm the opening times that I have on my business page, and it took me about a minute to realize I'm not talking to a human, and that kind of freaked me out. There was like little, it wasn't a glitch. It was just, I asked a more complex question and then they kind of started repeating themselves. And I'm like, oh, fuck. Because for a minute, I thought I had a human relationship. I mean, relationship, it was quite transactional, but still, if the robot is doing like little tricks, look, it can jump now. Yeah, but, tomorrow they're going to do backflips. And then the day after, exponential development, they're going to operate on your grandma, and then the day after, they're going to revolutionize the medicine, like the system. I mean, so I think what we're facing sooner rather than later is a successful illusion of a human relationship to a point where people feel really helped in that relationship. So there's lots of ethical issues, but like, I mean, the potential is enormous,
Yeah, interesting. So we've just come to the end of our podcast, and I want to ask you.
That flew by.
I want to ask you about what you're currently working on and how people might work with you. But before we do that, is there anything else that you really wanted to talk about and share that we haven't sort of surfaced yet?
I think a message for coaches would be this encouragement to first of all look inside about who you are and what your grounding is, what you are grounded in, and seek the processes that can help you have that kind of show up in spaces with that kind of groundedness, and really that discomfort of challenging what used to hold you. So I think there's lots of things that we could talk about, but like, I think that's a message that's important to me. And I don't think we need to discuss it any more than we already have.
All right. Great. Thank you, Yannick. So just tell us then, your future plans. You're currently working on Coaching Lab. That seems to be your main area of focus. Correct me if I'm wrong. Tell us about Coaching Lab. What are you trying to do with it? Where's it going? How do people engage with it?
Yeah, thanks. It really started from feedback that I very, very regularly, almost every training I've ran, regardless of how long it was, when we asked, what are you taking away from today? What was the most valuable part for you? At least half of the people tend to say some form of seeing the coaching in action, seeing somebody doing it or trying it out myself and getting some feedback on it, like really connecting the theory to practice. And that practical part was often missing, right? Even it's rare that you get to see even the coach trainers do a demonstration. Many coaches don't want to do demonstrations. Many coach trainers don't want to do demonstrations. And even when they do, it's 10, 15 minutes, maybe 20, maybe 30 if you're lucky. So I wanted to create an event where that's the sole focus. Really see a whole session, 45 minutes. 45 minutes could be longer, but like 45 minutes I figured is a good amount. And then talk about what happened, have reflections from coach and the client. How did you experience that question, that silence, that awkward moment? Oh, that wasn't awkward at all. That's so interesting. It was awkward to me. Where did that question come from? What theoretical framework, what philosophical grounding, what other questions did you have in mind but didn't get to ask? So I wanted coach and client to be there so we can take a look really under the hood of coaches and experienced coaches at that. So it's been really fascinating to have somebody run a whole session and then talk to them and then go into breakouts and have just a space to experiment with some new stuff while it's not a paying client. So that's been great. So we're running that once a month, and I can see myself running many, many more of those. And they don't even, I facilitate all of them at the moment, but I can certainly see, soon getting other facilitators on board and just, people love the space. And I can scale this, right? I can make this available to so many more coaches than I personally have time for. So that's been really good. And I'm excited about growing that. So that's in line with all the content we want to put out there, right?
What's the website, Yannick?
The website, we've just published it literally 2 days ago, is gocoachinglab.com.
Excellent. Good. Gocoachinglab.com. Excellent. Good. All right. What else is on your horizon?
I'm still excited about supervision groups. I'm putting a lot. I had to focus a lot more, right? If you asked me this question a year ago, I would have told you a lot of different things. I think right now I'm really focusing on everything that's aligned to bringing people in that space, right? Not necessarily in the coaching lab with that kind of format and concept, but in what's attached to it, right? The Cabinet is a free peer support group every third Tuesday of the month where we just support each other. Anything business, anything personal, anything practice related. Let's exchange ideas. Let's share experiences. So really building a community where people can show up. It can be lonely as a coach when you come out of training. The people you talk to are your clients, but if you're not very active in a professional body, then it can get lonely as a coach. So getting coaches together, getting them into spaces where they can exchange ideas, putting a lot more conversations out there, putting a lot more little snippets for the attention span shortened generation, perhaps. There's a lot of YouTube shorts, I'm not on TikTok. I'm not sure if I'm going to get there. Maybe yes, maybe no. But the idea is to bring short little nuggets out and make them visible to a lot more coaches than I currently have access to. So hopefully we can create more of it's already a global community, but a much more vibrant one. And I know this is something you're passionate about as well.
And if somebody wants to work with you directly as a coach or as a supervisor, how can they find out about you and access your services?
Best address for coaches is rocketsupervision.com. And people find a little bit more about what that metaphor is about. I really want to offer all of my professional hats. Some is coaching, sometimes it's supervision, sometimes it's business mentoring or deep existential work. I just integration-wise decided that that's my integrative approach, right? That's where I work with coaches who want to be the best coaches they can be. For coaching, it's existential.coach. So that's still my kind of main website. Anybody who's looking to work with me in some way, they'll find all the contact details there.
Very nice. Thank you so much, Yannick. Yannick, it's been an absolute pleasure to interview you. Is there anything else you want to say before we close off?
No, just thank you, Nick. I really appreciate what you do for the coaching community and the fresh thinking and the challenge you offer. We've connected on being quite aligned with, our existential roots, perhaps, even though we have that in different ways. But thank you for all the opportunities, right? Your coaching school is amazing. I loved running the podcast. It wouldn't be happening without Animas being behind that as a production team. And I really appreciate the support you've given me over the years. And it's nice to give back to you too.
Good, thank you. Well, you always finish the podcast with appreciation, and I'm not going to let you finish this podcast with appreciation of me. I'm going to do that. So I want to appreciate you for everything you do, Yannick. You seriously are one of the most prolific thinkers and contributors to the coaching world today, I would say. And it's interesting because there is a certain generation of coaches who, and we can all name them, and they've done amazing work for coaching, but there's a point where they will pass that baton on. And I can't help but believe that you are one of those people that will become one of the big baton holders of the future. Indeed, you hold that baton now, but I really have a sense that you, in the next 10 years, you'll be one of the major baton holders. It's fantastic to watch you do what you do. It really is a pleasure to see. So thank you so much. I am going to pass the chair back to you because this is the end of season 13. So I'm going to pass the chair back to you and put you back in it for season 14. Thank you so much, Yannick, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you, Nick.